However, I think I remember some of your tweets where you actually mentioned that now they lost the ability and the power they had with the tools they had in place. How did that
Yeah.
happen? And can you expand on that?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. And it's the most important topic in all of macro that nobody talks about. And even if I'm wrong, I would just love to hear someone tell me why I'm wrong, because I've brainstormed it, I've thought it through, and I don't think I'm wrong. And I want to know why I'm wrong. Like we learn from when we learn why we're wrong. We don't, being right all the time is
Mhm.
not the best thing. You want to be
Right.
wrong sometimes so that you can learn and that you can grow. I'm really waiting for one of those bigger guys out there, like a Luke Groman or a Lynn Alden or George
Mhm.
Gammon, or just please somebody tell me why I'm wrong. Because this is what's happening right now. The US Treasury and the Federal Reserve have lost the power to create demand by raising interest rates. Now, that's actually a
Mhm.
really concerning statement, and as a US citizen, I personally feel that it should be on the level of national economic security concern. This should be the highest and best economists in our country, both public and private, should be working together to think tank this, because we have a big problem on our hand. And the problem is that there's fiscal dominance. So the Federal Reserve is using their monetary policy to try to create demand destruction and try to slow the rate of credit growth, right? Because when
Mhm.
interest rates go up, the price of money goes up, so the cost to borrow goes up, so people borrow less. The economy
Right.
starts to slow down. Um, that's called demand destruction, and that's working. We're seeing that work for sure. Um,
Mhm.
but that's not the only thing going on. That's like you're watching a hockey game. Shout out to the Florida Panthers, right? Where Stanley Cup champions are here in Florida. Well, that's like watching a hockey game and only paying attention to one person on the ice. If you're not paying attention to all the other people on the ice and where the puck is going versus where it just
Right.
is right now, you're not going to really enjoy the game that much. You have to watch it from that higher up level. I always love the seats. I love the first row on the top shelf because it gives you that best, no one's in front of you and you have that overhead view and you can really see how the players are moving on the ice and how fast the game really goes. But that's really what's happening right now. I think a lot of these regulatory bodies are so focused on, they're just getting pulled 1,000 different directions. I spoke at the Bitcoin Energy Summit not that long
Mhm.
ago, and I was on a panel with Congressman Byron Donalds, who is our Southwest Florida representative. And by the way, maybe tonight we'll learn that he was Trump's vice president. He was one of the
Mhm.
names on the list that could become the vice president
Vice President.
for
Mhm.
Donald Trump. So it was an honor to sit on that panel with him and have some time with him. And on the Financial Services Committee, they're talking about, um, part of the conversation is that hey, we have to pay attention to the level of demand on U.S. Treasuries, right? So this is not just two people on YouTube talking about lack of demand
Mhm.
on U.S. Treasuries. This is Congressman Byron Donalds, who told me to my face and a group of people at Bitcoin Energy Summit that on the United States Financial Services Committee, they are talking about lack of demand on U.S. Treasuries. And one of those solutions that the committee was looking at was the stablecoin bill, because the
Mhm.
stablecoin bill being passed here in the United States, forcing stablecoins that trade here in the United States to be reserve backed by US dollar cash or cash equivalents, would create
Mhm.
demand for those US treasuries. And the perfect example is Tether and USDC. Right? Tether is actually one of the largest US treasury holders in the world. I think like number 12 or 13 largest US
Mhm.
treasury holder in the world. And the stablecoin market continues to explode, going from just a few million to now up to 150 billion just between Tether and USDC. USDC Circle is a publicly traded company, and they hold short-term treasury debt, and that's publicly reported. So these stable coins are seen as a solution to the lack of demand on U.S. Treasuries, and they're so focused on that and focused on
Mhm.
other things too. That's just one thing, right? Like it could take a long time just to have that one conversation. We could do multiple episodes talking about that. Um,
Right.
Matter of fact, I think that stablecoin bill there, Anthony Pomp
Hmm.
did a podcast the other day talking about how stablecoins could save the dollar. But something that nobody's talking about is if you pass that bill, if the U.S. Congress passes that stablecoin bill, now there will be two options for people in the United States. You will be able to keep your dollars in stablecoins that are legally required to be backed 1-to-1, or
Hmm.
you can keep your money in a bank deposit account, which is legally required to be backed 10 cents to one. And there is no, there actually, after COVID, there is no requirement. It's up to the bank. And then the bank
Hmm.
has that goes through stress tests and have to meet different liquidity levels and such. But there is no guaranteed requirement.
Hmm.
You can be banked. You could be backed from a penny to 10 cents for every $1 that you have. Imagine if something goes wrong and you have your money in a bank, and you only would get $10,000 back in terms of purchasing power, because they print the rest. You get everything back, but what you'd be able to buy with
Yeah.
it wouldn't be there, because the FDIC would have to print so much to cover all the insurance. But the point is that now you're offering a choice to the marketplace. And that is, hey, do you want to keep your money where it's backed 1-to-1? You have 24/7 access with nobody's permission, or would you like to keep it over here in the bank where you can get access Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, 9 to 6, and then on Saturday, like
Hmm.
8 to 2, and then
Yeah.
forget Sunday. Like, if you need it for Sunday, come on Saturday when you need it. And by the way, bring your permission form too. If you want more than $10,000, you're going to need to let us know ahead of time so we can make sure that we can facilitate that transaction for you. Just like
Right.
so you're creating demand on treasuries by passing the stablecoin bill, but it might be like the Trojan horse to destroy the entire banking system, because when interest rates went up, people left the banking system and went to the money market funds, and that's what
Hmm.
created the banking crisis. That's why Silicon Valley Bank failed, because they already took the depositors' money and bought the fixed income assets. The interest rates went up. They bought it at a lower rate. They lost the difference between that rate movement. So that people wanted their deposits back to go over to the money market fund so they can get the higher rate. And that caused the bank run. Well, imagine people wanting to get their money out of the bank because they don't want it backed 10 cents to one. They don't want to have to ask permission to use it. They want it backed 1-to-1. And they want it
Right.
anytime they can use it 24/7. This could create a new crisis for the banking system. And people are just ignoring that. So they're focused on that. Is a perfect example where we could literally do an entire episode on just that Trojan horse of the stablecoin bill and what that can mean for the
Hmm.
U.S. banking system. And then we're supposed to expect that they, with everything else that they're handling, they're supposed to understand this too. So they're stretched so many different ways. And Byron said that too. I brought this up to Byron, and he said, no, no one ever made that point. And I hope he did make that point in the Financial Services Committee. Such a small world that a chance that CJK could have brought up a topic in the U.S. Congress Financial Service Committee. Amazing, but it's true, and that's how these things work. So, I say all that to say this: the Federal Reserve is not focusing on these problems, and they may not recognize it. But I think this is the biggest problem, and that's fiscal dominance. Right. So going back to what
Hmm.
the Fed is doing with monetary policy, raising the interest rates to destroy demand, that's working on everyday people like you and me. We don't want to buy
Right.
a house because we're not going to pay 8-9% for a mortgage. We don't want to
Hmm.
put out credit at 30%. We don't want the market's frozen right now because nobody's incentivized because the costs are too high. So that creates demand destruction. But
Hmm.
who's not incentivized by the interest rates? The US government. The US
Hmm.
government is not behaving the way they should be behaving. Everybody else is behaving the way they should be behaving. There's been credit destruction. Sure, credit values have gone up, but there's no doubt that there's been demand destruction in the economy. You can see that in the sales numbers. You can
Hmm.
see it everywhere. So there's no doubt that that's working for the everyday person. But the government is almost immune to those incentives. The government doesn't care that the interest rate up. The U.S. government now pays more for the interest on its debt than it does for the U.S. military. It is now the number 3 line
Oh.
item in the U.S. budget. Only Social Security and Medicare cost more than the U.S. interest on debt. We spend more to pay the interest on our debt than we do to run our military. And to run our military, we pay more than everybody else in the world combined, just to give you an idea how much we
Yeah.
spend on our military. So
Yeah.
combine every other countries in the world military spending, combine it together, we spend more than them, and we spend more on our interest on debt than we do on our military. And just a couple of years ago, we interest on debt was a non item. It was never even considered. It wasn't even a concern. But the government is not changing their spending behavior. We're spending $1 trillion every 100 days. We're running $3+ trillion deficits, and we're running it at higher rates. Plus, over the next 2 years, 11 trillion out of the $35 trillion in debt is going to mature and need to be rolled over. And it's not rolling over from zero, but it is rolling over to a higher rate, which is going to increase the interest rate cost. So these interest rate costs are going to continue to climb. It very well could be that the interest rate cost flips Medicare and becomes the number 2 most expensive item, and eventually it become number 1 most expensive item if they don't artificially state the rates back down, because the higher rates are not properly incentivizing the government to slow their spending. The government is ignoring that incentive. Because that incentive is being ignored, it switches the paradigm. We move from a monetary dominance to a fiscal dominance. So when monetary dominance is there, that would be like the 70s, like when they raised interest rates to 20%. But when they raised interest rate to 20%, the US government debt was not that large. The amount of interest payments that needed to be paid still didn't really matter. So it wasn't a big deal. You could raise the interest rate. It was monetary dominance. What happened in the monetary decisions was more important than what was happening on the fiscal side, because there was no weight to that. There was no gravity to that increase in interest rate. There was no huge burden on the government to pay interest expense when they raised the rate that high. But here we are now, so many years later, and we've piled up $36 trillion of debt. We got another $216 trillion of unfunded liabilities. We're sending money here and everywhere else, and rates are higher. And the math, this is not opinion. The math shows that the interest rate expense has grown to now be the number 3 largest expense, very soon to be number 2. And there's nothing they can do about it, because it's already the size of the debt. Right? Only paying off the debt would help, because that's the only way to avoid the interest accrual. So there's no way to avoid it. When they raise the interest rates, they're increasing the amount of liquidity that needs to be borrowed and spent into circulation. And by the way, the people who they're paying it to are spending it back into the economy, increasing demand. So what happens? I say all that to say this: you would think as a lender, you would say, oh, okay, well, if the US government wants me to lend them money, they could just raise their interest rate, right? Because when they raise their interest rate, it's going to attract demand. The higher the interest rate, the higher the demand for the debt. That's actually why I always thought like interest rate. I remember when I was first learning it, I'm like, interest rate. Okay, hey, that makes sense. The higher the rate, the more interest, not like interest earned, but like interest from people. Like, how do you get people to buy your debt? How do I make you interested in buying my debt?
Right.
I have to raise the interest rate. So the higher that rate of earning is, the more interest
Attractiveness. Yeah.
from the people. So that's typically how it would work. The Federal Reserve would or the US Treasury would raise the interest rate, and then that would attract my demand, and I would lend them money because they're willing to pay a higher rate. Well, something's happened. When you raise the interest rate, because we're no longer in monetary dominant cycle and we're now in a fiscal dominant cycle, when you raise the interest rate, it actually forces more money to be printed on the fiscal side, because you're raising the interest rate against $35 trillion of debt, $3 trillion of deficit spending per year, $216 trillion of unfunded liabilities over the next 50 years. All the cost to finance that and roll it increases significantly with each basis point that you increase the interest rate. And that means that the faster that money needs to be printed and borrowed, the faster the inflation takes place. So the interest rate going up is supposed to attract a lender. But me as the lender, I'm saying, hey, yeah, let's say they move the rate from 5.25 to 5.5 up to 6. I would say, hey, okay, hey, now instead of 5, I'm getting 6. I'll lend them even more money, right? That's what you would expect the normal person to say. But I think some more astute money managers are starting to realize, well, wait a second. When they go to 6%, the national debt interest expenditures are going to be the number two highest cost, which means they're going to have to print more money, which is going to create more inflation,
Hmm.
which means the real rate of return is going to be lower. And I have to share this on Govflation because I think it's going to help people kind of just understand what I'm talking about when I say real rate. So let me see if I could pull this up and get us over there. Okay, cool. So here's like what the government's official government headlines versus like Govflation headlines. And I'm not going to dive too deep into this because I want to stay focused on real rates. The real rate of return is the risk-free rate, so the US government debt treasury rate, and it could be, I would say typically it would be a bill, but it could be a note or a bond depending on how much wiggle room you want to give them. Right now, with an inverted yield curve, it's best to use the bills because you have the front end of the yield curve being the highest rate. Whereas if it was normalized, the long end of the curve, the bond end of the curve would be the
Hmm.
highest rate. And typically the highest rate is what you subtract from the rate of inflation in order to understand in terms of purchasing power what you're getting returned. Right? So if you look at
Hmm.
the official government headlines, they say that the CPI is 3.3%. Okay, well, since you can get a government treasury bill for 5.5%, then you have to take the 5.5% that you're earning in the treasury bill, and then you have to deduct the 3.3% increase in prices because that's going to tell you that your real return on purchasing power, right? So if you use the government's numbers, if you lend them money today, at the end of the year, you will be able to buy 2.2% more stuff. So in terms
Hmm.
of purchasing power, yeah, you bought a bill that says 5.5%, but because prices are going up 3.3%, you're really only going to be able to buy 2.2% more stuff. That
Hmm.
that analysis is called the real rate of return. Understanding the rate of return in terms of purchasing power, not just the numbers on the screen, because that's what matters to us, how much we can buy with our time and
Right.
energy, right? In Venezuela, everybody was a millionaire, but
Yeah.
nobody was rich. So it didn't matter. It doesn't matter how high the nominal numbers go. It matters the quality of life and standard of living that can be produced with the your production and allows you to consume with your purchasing power at a rate that was greater than the year before, right? Because that's when lending money makes sense to somebody. You don't lend money to somebody so that they pay you back and then you can buy less stuff with your money.
Right.
That's not, you're better off just keeping your money under your mattress and not taking any
Yes.
risk, right?
Yeah.
So
True.
you need a positive real rate of return to be incentivized to lend your money to somebody. Well, just take a look at this. We go back and we say the CPI we use the 1982 equation, government equation, right? So I know a lot of people know about trueflation. Trueflation, they have a proprietary equation. That's why they say inflation is lower than what the government says it is. They're using their own equation to calculate inflation. I didn't want to do that at Govflation. So at Govflation, we use the government's equation, right? This has nothing to do with my opinion. This
Hmm.
is just the government's methodology, and really it took place in 1983. And I have a really good tweet. I wish I could pull up, but people should just check it out because um, you can see it on X. And I talk about how there's this website called WTF happened in 1971.com, and it brings you to like these charts that show you when they remove the gold from backing those layer two
Hmm.
paper dollar solutions, all these things that changed in the economy because of the effects of inflation, basically. And so we have a website called WTF happened in 1983.com. And if you go to what WTF happened in 1983.com, it'll actually just redirect you to this site because what happened is they changed the CPI methodology and they changed
Hmm.
the cost of goods index to a cost of living index. And basically what that means is in 1982, they measured inflation based on a constant standard of living. So if you like filet mignon, then the constant standard of living is going to tell you how much it costs based on you eating filet mignon every night. because that's what you want, and that's a constant standard. When they changed it from the cost of goods index to the cost of living index, they introduced what was called substitution hedonics. And what it does is it tries to say, if the price of filet goes up, but the price of hamburger meat goes down, then the consumer is not going to buy the filet. They're going to buy the hamburger meat. So they're making an assumption. They're making that demand assumption based on price that I will buy the hamburger meat instead of the filet. But that's the whole point. If I was eating filet and I want filet, but now I have to eat a hamburger, the quality of life, the standard of living has gone down. I'm not trying to
Decreases.
measure. I'm not trying to measure uh, the amount of my quality of life and standard of living if it goes down. What do I care if it goes down? I'm trying to avoid that. I'm working my ass off so my quality of life and standard of living can go up, not so that it
Right.
can go down.
Right.
I don't really
Or
care.
or look, or at least remains stagnant,
Or,
right?
yeah, or
Or
at
at
least
least.
stay the same, right? At least stay the
Yeah.
same. But that's why having a constant standard of living, measuring for a constant standard of living is so important, because if that goes up and you're not beating it, then you can identify that your quality of life and standard of living are going down, right? But when the equation tries to do it for you, basically what people do who use these official government headlines are saying is, yeah, I'm okay with my quality of life and standard of living going down. Everything that money gets printed for, I believe in, and I'm willing to give up my quality of life and standard of living in order for them to spend that money on my behalf. Well, we don't believe
Right.
that. And govflation is taking the opposite side of that and saying, hey, I want to measure the quality of my life against a constant standard of living. And that's going to allow me to understand if my quality of life is going up or down. And then I can direct my efforts or my business decisions based on the direction of my quality of life or standard of living. And it's at 11.1%. So when you take the 5.5% that you get from the Treasury bill and you subtract it from real inflation that measures a constant standard of living at 11.1, look at your rate of return. Negative
Right.
5.6%. Well, when the real rate of return is negative, you should not lend your money. Why would you? You're getting back less purchasing power. You're losing. You're lending money. And when you get paid back, you can buy 5% smaller home, a
Yeah.
5% shittier car,
Yeah.
5% less food and snacks for the family. Why would you lend your money and be okay with being able to buy back less once you finally
Less.
get paid back? It doesn't make sense. This is part of the reason they have to use methodology to manipulate the output of this number, because see, real return on the official government headlines is green. Green means good. Real return on the govflation headline is red. Red means bad. So according to the government numbers, yeah, you should lend them money. You're going to increase your purchasing power. But according to the real numbers, no, you should not lend your money to the government. You're going to lose purchasing power. Now, when they raise interest rates and then they force more money to be spent, that increases CPI. So let's say they raise the interest rate from 5% to 6%. Okay, well, the real inflation rate, let's just start with the government. The government inflation rate could go from 3.5% to, I don't know, say 5.5%. Well, now the real rate is zero, right? So they raised the interest rate. You would think when they raise the interest rate, the real rate of return would go up. But because when they raise the interest rate, it forces the fiscal side to create inflation, CPI goes up. And because that forced inflation raises CPI, it actually reduces the real rate of return. And that's what's happening here. Because of the mountains of debt, because there is just so much debt, we no longer have monetary dominance. We have fiscal dominance. And when you raise interest rate in an environment of fiscal dominance, it actually lowers the real rate of return. So any money manager who's worth their salt and his job is to protect and preserve not just the nominal number on the screen, but the purchasing power of that number through time and space, is not going to be willing to lend their money to the government just because they raise interest rates. And this is what you were talking about before. To me, one of the most important things that's going on in the marketplace. They have really lost the ability, not that they want to raise them any higher. If they raise them any higher, the economic stress, I think, will just become blatantly evident. So they're limited by
Mhm.
the economy on how much they can raise them anyway. But you would think, oh, in an emergency situation, we could just raise rates, and then people will be they'll be lining up in droves to lend us money. Yeah, but people who understand the difference between a nominal rate of return and a real rate of return are going to be
Mhm.
less interested, not more interested. And that's one of the biggest
Right.
problems in all of macro and finance today.